Okay, are we recording? We are recording. So let's make like a black eyed peas, get it started in here. All right, so when we last left our intrepid hero, Charles Darwin, or as I like to call him, Chuck D, the Beagle had finally gotten back to England. Darwin spent some time with his family, spent several years living in London, and later on, after his marriage, moved to Down House, which was a little country village outside of London, and now it's all suburbs because London has grown so much. And you can visit it. It's maintained as a museum. He was quite busy. I think I mentioned that he never had to hold down a job per se because his family had a great deal of money. We'll find out in a minute how they got it. But remember, he'd been sending back letters and shipping back specimens to Britain. I mean, the Royal Navy had an awful lot of ships, and the Beagle would periodically meet other ships in the Navy, and if they were going back, that was how letters and packages and things could get home. It wasn't exactly FedEx, but it did the trick. And a lot of people wanted to talk with this new hotshot who had spent almost 5 years traveling around the world. And he had his hands full. He helped to write the official account of the voyage. He started working on books of his own. I mentioned that he wrote a book on the geology of South America. His first book was his hypothesis about the growth of coral islands, that hypothesis that turned out to be correct, although it wasn't conclusively shown until the 50s, when we started nuking coral islands. And he collaborated with various experts. He worked at writing up official reports on the animals, plants, fossils, etc., everything that had been collected. I think I did mention that he did, in fact, spend 8 years on a study of barnacles, which I promise is more interesting than it sounds, because I mentioned he discovered barnacle species where the male is so highly reduced that it's basically nothing but a very long penis and a testicle kind of in a little sac, and that's all. And this would actually play some role in his thinking about evolution, but I'm getting ahead of myself. He married in 1839. That's his wife, Emma. She was also, incidentally, his first cousin, although the dangers of that were not really understood at the time. They did go on to have 10 kids and a very happy marriage, very happy and very conventional as far as I know. Michaela's here. Good. All right. Hello, Michaela. Good morning. So we've got Darwin back in London. He married his wife Emma in 1839. He also started coming down with recurrent attacks of chronic illness. Nobody knows exactly what it was. It may have been a chronic parasitic disease that he might have picked up in South America. You can get, now I can't remember what it's called, but it's transmitted by the bite of a biting insect that, at least in Spanish, is called the benchuca. I don't know what it would be in Portuguese.
Maybe Chagas disease?
Yeah, that's it, Chagas disease. Yeah, I drew a blank on the name. It might have been Chagas disease, although some of the symptoms aren't quite right. I've read a whole book claiming that it was psychological, that what he had was chronic panic attacks, getting into the psychoanalysis and unresolved issues with his father and things like that. I don't think I really buy that. The last paper I've read suggests it might have been an inherited mitochondrial disease, because his mother also was ill and in fact died young. And the inheritance pattern fits because it's something that It's something that follows a mitochondrial inheritance pattern. Women get it, men get it, but men don't pass it on. So I don't think we'll ever truly know unless we like DNA test his body, and nobody really wants to do that. It left him, he had all kinds of digestive disturbances that I won't go into because it's kind of gross. It left him chronically weak. He'd spend whole days pretty much holed up on the sofa. He did a lot of reading while he was sick, and he would actually, if he had a heavy book to read, he'd cut it in half so that he could, so that he could hold it up, not have it, you don't want a heavy book falling on your face and, maybe cutting off your windpipe. It did leave him. There's a way in which it was fortunate for his science, because if he'd been healthy, he would have been expected to enter into the social round, and he would have had to host parties and go to parties and socialize a lot. And that would have taken away a lot of the time for thinking that he had. But as an invalid, he didn't have a great deal of fun, but he did leave a long life, and he did have a great deal of time to work on his science. He never left Britain again, but he was able to do a lot of experiments at his country house in growing plants, raising pigeons, as you've seen. And he did end up writing 20 books in his lifetime. So he was sick, but he sure wasn't a slacker. Incidentally, he was a very methodical thinker. He wasn't the kind of brilliant genius that comes up with aha, boom ideas. He was a plotter, but he was very methodical and very able to stick to it, very able to pursue his thoughts wherever they led. This is, natural selection was not some idea that just came to him in a flash of inspiration. He'd end up working on it for 20 years. And just to show you how he thinks, this was a list of the pros and cons that he made of whether he should get married or not. The pros are he could have children, you have a constant companion and friend in old age who will feel interested in one, objects to be beloved and played with better than a dog anyhow. I'm not really sure this is the kind of thing that would be advisable to say today. Like, should I get married? Well, she'd be better than a dog. Home and someone to take care of house. These things are good for one's health, but a terrible loss of time. But he did eventually decide to get married, and he did. And his wife, Emma Darwin, was okay. She was smart, she was not stupid, but she was pretty contented with being a pretty typical housewife at the time. She, I think they always played 5 games of backgammon in the evening, and she always did that. She waited on him when he was sick. She basically took care of the household, and that was fine for her. She was a very good nurse. He was a very good patient. And it was a very loving marriage as far as anybody now knows. And thanks to her, he did have time to ponder this problem of where species came from. That's one of his notebooks. He saved everything. So part of the reason this lecture can be so detailed is that we have a massive amount of his papers and letters. They're working on publishing every letter that he wrote or was written to him. Last I looked, they were up to something like 24 volumes with quite a lot more to go. If you're really hardcore, they've got most of those volumes at the UCA library. And this is one of his notebooks from the year after the beagle got back, where he's pondering how species might arise. You have, incidentally, he had terrible handwriting. but you have an ancestor here, and somehow that ancestor has to branch. And some of those branches go extinct, they don't lead to anything, but some of those branches lead to a descendant species A, and here's more descendants B, C, and D. This looks a little bit like a diagram that you should have been exposed to in 1441. Do you guys do planograms? Yeah, so he's thinking about this. And here's why you need to study your core curriculum and not just the majors classes. Because he read not just biology, but economics and history, and the work of these two gentlemen, Thomas Malthus, we talked about yesterday, and the other guy that he read about was a Scottish philosopher by the name of Adam Smith. Smith had written a book called On the Wealth of Nations, and it is a classic example of argument for free market capitalism. He's sometimes cited as being, in support of completely unregulated free market capitalism, which he wasn't exactly. He was quite a bit more moderate than he sometimes claimed. But he argued that if you had just competition among merchants is the best way to maximize profits in an economy, boost quality, and make reasonable prices. The example I always give is, imagine that 20 shoe stores opened up one day in Valonia, Arkansas. Okay, you've all heard of Valonia, right? It's a little town of what, 5,000 people or so, not too far from here. There's probably not enough people in Valonia to keep 20 shoe stores going. I'm just guessing here, right? I mean, given that only about 10 of them wear shoes, but I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. Okay, but think about what will happen. Some of those shoe stores are going to quickly go out of business, right? Some of them are going to stay in business, and the ones that do stay in business should be the ones that, maybe some will stay in business by selling inexpensive shoes. Others might stay in business by selling more expensive shoes, but really good quality. Maybe some will stay in business because they invent a new type of shoe that nobody's ever seen before and everybody wants it, and they'll make lots of cash. Some of them might stay in business by specializing in shoes that nobody else has. So maybe one store will specialize in work boots and another will specialize in Manolo Blahniks or whatever those fancy shoes are on Sex and the City that they were always going on about. And so the idea is that if you just let those stores compete, first of all, a store that sells its shoes for higher prices than people are willing to pay is going to go out of business. So prices are kept down by competition. Stores that innovate and come up with new types of shoes that everybody wants, they'll do well, and stores that don't innovate will go out of business. And so the end result is you get a fair price that's a good compromise between quality and price. You'll get good value. You reward innovators. You penalize the bad businessmen. And in reality, it's a lot more difficult than that because Adam Smith didn't count on Walmart, who basically just F's everybody. They can do that because when you're that big, you have resources that your average shoemaker doesn't. But Adam Smith referred to competition as an invisible hand. And the idea is, what's important here is that in a competitive environment like that, you don't need an outside designer. You don't need some commissar or some bureaucrats from the National Shoe Board or Federal Board of Shoe Sale Regulations or whatever it is. You don't need an outsider. coming in and designing your economy. You don't need anybody to set the prices and set the number of shoes that can be made and set the number that you're going to sell. You can get an orderly market where prices are stable and quality's decent, not by planning it from the top down, but by letting a bunch of people compete from the bottom up. So this is the very beginning of his answer to Paley, in that you can get order in a system without there being a designer. If you have a bunch of agents that are all competing for something, you don't need somebody to come in from above. You don't need a designer or a commissar from the Soviet Republic or whatever it is to fix everything. You can let these things fix themselves and you'll end up with a stable system that works. At least one would ideally, like I said, Adam Smith, come on, Wagner. Adam Smith had never had to deal with Walmart, but on paper, it seems to work. And it's the beginning of an answer to how you can get order in a system. Malthus, we saw in the flick yesterday, or he was mentioned, and Thomas Malthus wrote an essay on the principle of population, and he was the guy that argued that in any country, you can always grow more food by putting more land into cultivation, by developing better technology, maybe better fertilizers or more productive varieties of whatever you're growing. You can increase the food supply, but the population growing exponentially will ultimately outstrip the food supply. You can't grow the food supply fast enough to keep up with exponential growth. That means there's always going to be some kind of social inequality and poverty. There are policies you can take that will minimize those. And one of the things that Malthus did advocate for was better education, especially for women. Because if you educate women and give them things to do with their lives, give them more options than being kept barefoot and pregnant, as they used to say, barefoot in the winter and pregnant in the summer. If you give them better lives than that, then the birth rate goes down. And we've actually seen that in quite a lot of countries. What's important here is that Darwin realized that the same logic applied to every species, not just humans. That any population is capable of exponential growth and eventually is going to come up with hard limits of how large that growth can be. So as he wrote, he happened to read Malthus on population, and as he said, it had once struck me that under these circumstances, favorable variations would tend to be preserved and unfavorable ones to be destroyed. The results of this would be the formation of a new species. Here then, I had at last got a theory by which to work. So he puts everything together, and his first sketch of what would become the theory of natural selection, he wrote down in 1841. He wrote a more detailed sketch in 1844. And as he told his friend, the botanist Joseph Dalton Hooker, I determined to collect blindly every sort of fact which could bear any way on what are species. I am almost convinced, quite contrary to opinion I started with, that species are not immutable. Species are not unchanging. As he put it, it is like confessing a murder. So how does it work? Oh, Hooker, by the way, told him this is a great idea, but what you really need to do is test it against very detailed study of some group of animals and plants, because it's very easy to come up with some sort of grand, overarching, massive hypothesis that explains everything, only to find that it just doesn't work when you actually test it against some real facts. And that is why Darwin spent 8 years studying barnacles. the subtext of that work was that he was seeing if everything he observed could be accounted for by the theory of evolution by natural selection, and he decided that it could. So that is why, as we found out in Epic Rap Battles of History, he spent 8 years studying barnacle dick. See, barnacle dick's really interesting because in barnacles as adults are glued in place and they can't move from place to place. And if you're a male, this makes it very tricky to fertilize the eggs of a female because the nearest female might be a couple of inches away. And you know, when you're that big, you know, if you're that big, it's kind of difficult if the nearest female is like that far away from you. And you can't move and neither can she. So male barnacles have these immensely long penises that they can just sort of whip around to find a female within a pretty sizable radius. And I'm sure you're all just absolutely overjoyed to know that. Anyway, right. So it starts like this, the way it finally broke down. In any population of any species, individuals vary. You can see that in your own family. You can see that in the student population. You know, we all have different heights and weights and builds and hair colors and skin colors and eye colors and tendencies towards genetic diseases or physiological conditions. We're all different. But you'd find that in any population that you care to look at. You could go out to the clover growing on the lawn out there and find differences among individual plants if you spent a little time on it. Individuals vary. Second critical point is variation is inherited. Individuals transmit their variant traits to any offspring they've got. You're different from everybody else. Your kids, if you have them, are going to look more like you than anybody else. You look more like your parents, your biological parents, than you would look like two people just selected at random off the street, right? We now call this heredity. And since you've all had genetics, you should have a good understanding of how it works. One of the things you have to remember when you're studying science from this time is that nobody knew how it worked. Mendel hadn't even published his experiments yet. I think Mendel was a teenager at this time. And so Darwin didn't know why individuals vary and how they pass their traits on, but they do. You can observe that in any family, any litter of dogs and cats, any garden plant that you propagate. It's empirically true, even if we don't have an explanation for it at this time. Individuals vary in populations of every species, from people to poppies to Polistes paper wasps. Those are paper wasps in the genus Polistes, and it was shown fairly recently that individual wasps can recognize other individuals by facial features. And you can see that every one of these wasps has a different face. And you could find that anywhere you look. You'll always find variation, even in clonal species that don't reproduce sexually. If you look, you can still find variation within a clone. And we know that variation is inherited because offspring show parental traits. Part 2 is where we go to Malthus. Any species, in theory, could increase its population exponentially and do it indefinitely. You start with a pair of bunny rabbits, and then in some time you get 4. And then you turn around and you've got 8. And then a month later, you've got 16. And then, holy cow, you've got 32. And your rabbits are breeding like rabbits, as we say. And any species is capable of doing that. Howdy. That's okay. Samantha, okay, sorry about that. Okay. So any species is capable of increasing exponentially, but we don't see this in nature. Populations in nature will tend to hold roughly constant. They might grow a bit, they might shrink a bit, they might bob up and down. Occasionally, they might even explode and then crash, like locusts. But they tend to stay within certain limits, and we never get indefinite exponential growth. It always slows down. The conclusion has to be that not every offspring that's produced can survive. And Darwin's insight here is that survival isn't random. It really bugs me when people who are kind of a little overexcited from listening to too much Hillsong try to inform me that evolution just means that everything happened by random chance, because that's exactly what natural selection isn't. Not all offspring can survive, and that sets up a metaphorical struggle for survival. Some individuals are going to be able to get enough resources to survive and reproduce. Other individuals won't. And the choice, in air quotes, of which individuals survive and which ones don't survive is not a choice that's made randomly. What was it? Memory serves, a female oyster, one of them, can produce, I believe it's 100 million eggs in a breeding season. And if the oyster is not hauled up out of the ocean and shucked and served on the half shell with horseradish sauce, that oyster might live for 20 years. So if a female oyster can crank out 20 billion offspring in a lifetime, then it should be painfully obvious that the overwhelming majority of those die. Because if they didn't, the ocean would be so full of oysters, there'd be no room for the fish. Right? Yes? So many of the offspring, in some cases, virtually all of them that are produced, don't make it. That sets up competition for resources, food, space, etc. And that's what Darwin called the struggle for existence. And some individuals manage to survive and reproduce, others don't. And which ones survive and which ones don't depends, at least in part, on the traits that they've got. And so here we have it now. Some individuals in any population will vary in ways that increase their chances, not their changes, that's an error, their chances of survival and reproduction. If we have a bunch of bunny rabbits in the forest and the big bad wolf appears, well, our rabbits are variable. Some of our rabbits will be able to run just a little bit faster than others, and they have better odds of getting away from the wolf. Some of those rabbits may be just a bit more agile than others, able to make sharp turns and zigzags, and they have a better chance of getting away from the wolf. Some of those rabbits may be protectively colored and able to camouflage themselves and have better odds of getting away from the wolf. Some of those rabbits may be intelligent and sensitive enough that they can hear the big bad wolf coming and escape in plenty of time. And they'll be the ones that have better odds of surviving and reproducing. On the other hand, some rabbits are going to be slow or clumsy or have brilliant colors that stick out like a sore thumb, or will just be really stupid and clueless. Those are the ones that have lower chances of reproducing successfully because they're the ones with the greatest odds of getting eaten. So over several generations, some traits in a population are going to become more common. the fast bunnies that get away from the wolf will mate with other fast bunnies and produce fast offspring. The camouflage bunnies are likely to mate with other camouflage bunnies and give rise to camouflage offspring. The bunnies with the fur that's like day glow orange. You ever seen a bunny with day glow orange fur? Now you know why. Because those are the ones that are likelier to get eaten, and they won't get to pass on their genes for day glow orange fur. So some traits become more common, others will become more rare or even disappear. Give this enough time. There's Lyle right there. Take this simple process, let it run for long enough, and separate populations of bunnies or anything else may become so different from each other that we can call them separate species. So if you have to break down natural selection into three basic principles, it's individuals vary, variation is inherited, and variation sometimes makes a difference. So there, Dr. Wagner's 3 laws of natural selection, if you like. Now, just to add something in here real quick, Darwin pointed out that when he talked about the struggle for existence, it's metaphorical. Phrases like the struggle for existence and one that Darwin didn't actually quote, this phrase was coined by one of the most boring people in history, a philosopher named Herbert Spencer. He's the guy who came up with the phrase survival of the fittest. When people hear phrases like that, they tend to assume that evolution is all about survival of the meanest, survival of the bloodiest. As the poet Alfred Lord Tennyson said, nature red in tooth and claw. So, you know, that evolution is all about bunnies desperately trying to get away from a savage wolf, or helpless mackerel desperately trying to escape a savage, bloodthirsty shark, or, you know, ferocious lions mercilessly hunting down innocent, cute gazelles on the Serengeti plain, or whatever kind of sensationalistic stuff they're showing on Animal Planet this week. And it needs to be said that's emphatically not the only way natural selection can operate. I mean, those things do happen, right? There's a reason why they call nature a mother, because sometimes nature can be a real mother. But as Darwin pointed out, you could talk about it, you know, if you're talking about plants, for example, it's much more metaphorical. The trees in the nature reserve are struggling because there's only a fixed amount of solar energy per square meter available on Earth. You know, there's a limited amount of solar energy that's there, and plants that can grow taller will be able to intercept more of it and shade out plants that don't grow as tall. So you do kind of have a struggle there, but it's not as if the trees are beating each other up, right? It's not like the trees are ants. Okay, it's not like the trees are ants that are having a barroom brawl at Isengard or something like that. Incidentally, it's fun to go to screenings of the Two Towers, and right when the Ents are marching on Isengard, you stand up and shout, "Run, Forrest, run!" Okay, don't really do it. I don't know. Okay, do it if you want to. You know, let me know how that goes. You could also talk about the struggle for existence as being a metaphorical struggle against the environment. A plant under drought conditions may be struggling, you know, in that it's difficult for that plant to get enough water or something like that, but that's not a violent struggle. It's not even really a competitive struggle. And very, 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 very often, one of the options for winning this metaphorical struggle for existence is cooperation. So, for example, the bunnies that are likeliest to survive the onslaught of the big bad wolf might end up being the bunnies that work out a cooperative system where some of them stand on guard while the others are feeding or something like that. I know you've been introduced at some point to the concept of symbiosis. We see this all the time. And there's lots of cases where even two unrelated species do better in a partnership than either one could do on its own. So when we talk about struggle for existence or even survival of the fittest, we don't mean survival of the most ruthless. We don't mean survival of the most bloodthirsty or survival of the most selfish. It's a metaphor. It's easy to take too far. The real world is a whole lot more interesting than that. That, by the way, is one of the things in the movie yesterday. We mentioned Charles Sumner, the professor at Yale, who decided that Darwinian evolution was scientific support for millionaire business tycoons being bastards to everybody else. Right? Yes, remember we talked about that? That's part of why he's wrong, incidentally, is that the struggle does not necessarily have to be the kind of cutthroat struggle that you see in business. Okay, great idea, Chuck, but how are you going to demonstrate it? Well, I mentioned he spent 8 years studying barnacles as a way to test his ideas against detailed study of a group in nature, but he also ended up raising fancy pigeons. And you saw some of these if you saw the film yesterday. There are a lot of fancy pigeons, and some of them look really crazy. And as Darwin said, I have kept every one that I could raise or obtain. I think the quote's here. There we go. Believing that it is always best to study some special group, I have, after deliberation, taken up domestic pigeons. I have kept every breed which I could purchase or obtain. The diversity of the breeds is something astonishing. I don't even know what all of these are, but up to the upper right, that's a fantail with this huge tail and this habit of sticking its breast out so much you can hardly see its head. Down at the lower center, that's a barb pigeon with these big circles of naked skin around its eyes. I think at the far left, that's a nun, because it's got these reverse feathers that kind of put a hood over its head. Center top, that's a tumbler pigeon with a tiny beak, and so on. There's a lot of really wacky looking pigeons in this world. And you'll find out that years ago, I read an Amazon review from somebody who had bought a copy of Darwin's Origin of Species and had read it. And she was expecting he was going to open up with some kind of double-barreled shotgun blast against God and Jesus and morality and mother and apple pie and Santa Claus. And she was kind of let down when she reads the first chapter and finds out that half of it's about bleeping pigeons. Like, what? She's expecting something with a little bit more fireworks. So he goes into what we know of the history of pigeon breeding. Apparently, the Egyptians were among the first to keep them. And wild pigeons look like this. And they're native to Europe and Asia. They've been introduced to this country. These are basically the feathered rats that you see in parks beating up old ladies and taking their breadcrumbs, right? There's usually a flock of them in Conway around the railroad tracks. I know you've seen them around here. And they vary. If you go out and look at a wild pigeon flock, you will see different colors and patterns. And breeders, for about the past 5,000 years, have been keeping pigeons and picking out individuals that had traits that they liked. Maybe pigeons that were bigger, maybe pigeons that were prettier, maybe pigeons that were better at doing things like navigating. Remember that pigeons have been used to carry messages all the way up until at least World War I, maybe after that even. So they've taken pigeons that have traits that they like. Those pigeons get to breed. Pigeons that don't have those traits presumably end up roasted or grilled, or whatever it is you do with a pigeon that you don't want to keep around. They probably ended up, I don't know, in the soup or fricassee or something. So you get rid of the pigeons that have traits that you don't want. You encourage the breeding of pigeons that you do want. And you repeat that generation after generation, and you can go from the wild rock pigeon to something like this. On the left, that's a Bahara trumpeter with these huge shoulder muffs of feathers that are so tall they completely cover its head. And there's also big ruffs of feathers on its feet. And I actually know somebody who used to raise fancy pigeons. And apparently the Bahara trumpeter is also colossally stupid because you can breed pigeons for intelligence as well as for physical traits. And the Bahara trumpeter has all of these intelligence of basically a cucumber or zucchini. They're really dumb. The English pouter, you can see, has the ability to inflate the upper part of its digestive tract. And so it constantly walks around with this hugely inflated upper chest that's, when I was in 7th grade, one of the worst insults you could give the other kids in gym class was, "Hey man, is that your head or is your neck blowing a bubble?" And no, it didn't make any sense, but 7th grade, few things do. So yeah, the English pouter, his neck actually is blowing a bubble. So it walks around looking kind of like a giant feathered lollipop. That English barb, you can see that's got those big circles of naked skin around its eyes and its beak. The frillback with the curly feathers. The short-faced tumbler with almost no beak and that really weird head that kind of, almost hangs over its beak. Compared with the Scandaroon pigeon with the great big hooked thing. And there's actually a website dedicated to the specific breeds of pigeon and even some of these stuffed specimens that Darwin made because he raised them, and when they died, he would taxidermy them. And so there's lots more information on Darwin's pigeons if you really must know. And they weren't just differences of feather color and length. Every part of a pigeon could be changed and had been changed by artificial selection. At the top left, that's the skull of a wild pigeon. Compared to top right, that's a short-faced tumbler. That's that bird with the weird head in the previous slide. And then down below, the Bagadotan carrier, I think that's another name for the Scandaroon. So that's the skulls of these two birds compared with the wild. And you can even change their behavior. Pigeons that have been selected for racing can navigate. People will actually have pigeon races. Pigeons can find their way home very well because they can actually use the Earth's magnetic field. So you can drive your pigeons 500 miles from your house, let them go, and time how long it takes them to return. And good homing pigeons can navigate as far as 1,100 miles. That's what, roughly 1,800 kilometers, averaging 50 miles an hour. That's about 80 kilometers an hour. I really should put everything in metric. I'm a scientist, darn it. The English short-faced tumbler is not nearly that good at speed flying, but it's called the tumbler because as it flies, it will turn somersaults. You have a flock of pigeons flying, and all of a sudden just kind of goes whoop and does a somersault in midair and then keeps on going. Whereas parlor roller pigeons can't fly, but if you put them on the ground, they'll start flapping their wings and they'll start doing somersaults. And I'll show this at the break. There is actually footage of people having a parlor roller competition, where they just put their birds on the ground and see how far they can roll. And it looks kind of like they're playing bocce ball or lawn bowling, except the balls are birds that are flapping their wings and going off in weird directions. So people have selected for behavior patterns. People have selected for intelligence. Homing pigeons are very smart and Bahara trumpeters are really stupid. And people have selected for every physical trait you can think of. And we can do lots of examples from this in the animal kingdom, because the same logic applies to dogs, cats, goldfish. You go to a pet store with a decent supply of fancy goldfish. They're all just basically silver carp, but there's all sorts of color patterns and double tails and long fins and eyes bugging out and, lion's mane on the head. There's all sorts of crazy traits that goldfish have developed because of artificial selection. You can see that in PetSmart if you want it. If you want a plant example, this is a plant that's native to Mexico and the adjacent US. In Spanish, it's called the chiltepín. And it's a pretty enough plant, and it makes these tiny red berries. And if you eat one of those berries, suffer a terribly intense burning sensation in your mouth. Tears come to your eyes and you're desperate for water. And roughly 10,000 years ago, some people who were probably very, very desperate ate a chiltepín berry. And after a few minutes of screaming, thought, "Hey, dude, let's do that again." I don't think they had invented beer, because otherwise I would be pretty sure that alcohol was involved in this decision to start eating chiltepín berries. But they started eating them. They started growing them because they observed, as you do, that berries have seeds in them, and when those seeds go into the ground, they make new plants. And they must have started selecting them. Chiltepín plants that had bigger berries, or tastier berries, or berries that didn't burn quite so much, berries that did not give you agonizing pain 36 hours later when you're having a bowel movement. Those are the ones that they would allow to grow. And chiltepín plants that did not produce bigger berries or tastier berries would get uprooted. Do this for 10,000 years and you go from chiltepín to most of the varieties of pepper that we have in supermarkets today. The exceptions are habanero peppers actually come from a different capsicum species. And there's a couple of South American pepper species that we tend not to get very much here. There's one called, I think, the ají that gets used in, I think, Peruvian cooking. And maybe some in Brazil, but I don't know what they would be called. But most of the ones that you get in the United States anyway are capsicum annuum, and they range from bell peppers at the upper left to chiles poblanos at the upper right. That's, if you ever order the chile relleno, the stuffed pepper at a Mexican restaurant, that's what you get. Serrano peppers and jalapeno peppers, cayenne peppers on the lower left. Those are the ones that are dried and ground up to make those hot pepper flakes. The peppers that are grown and ground up to make a different condiment called paprika. Ornamental peppers down below, those are Medusa peppers. That aren't real good for cooking, but they grow really long and stringy and look kind of like snake hair, except they're peppers. And yeah, most varieties that you get in the supermarket have been produced by about 10,000 years of artificial selection, all starting from the wild chiltepín berries. There are still people that grow Chictipinus. The wild species is not extinct. They're affectionately known as gringo killers because I'm told adding just a couple to your chili will make it quite spicy enough for most people. It's actually kind of neat. Birds don't feel the burn. So birds will eat those bright red chictapine berries and then poop the seeds out. And then the seeds can grow, and hey, look, they've got some fertilizer to go along with it. Mammals with longer digestive tracts digest the seeds. So if a mammal eats those berries, the seeds are lost. So by natural selection, we assume Chictapines have evolved the ability to produce these burning chemicals that means that most mammals don't want to eat them. Right? So the berries get eaten by birds, which can spread the seeds, not by mammals, which can't. But then humans came along and after feeling the burn decided, hey, I want some more. This is agonizing pain, but it's strangely compelling somehow. And started messing with everything and produced all of these pepper varieties by natural selection. That's a wild tomato, like genus Lycopersicon, sometimes called the currant tomato because it's also got these dinky little red berries. And from that, breeders have produced everything from stuffers, which are hollow tomatoes that don't have any of the juice in them, but very nice for stuffing and baking. Yellow pear tomatoes, which I used to grow. Green sausage tomatoes, very nice for cooks because you can get a lot of spices of exactly the same size. Togo trifle tomatoes, which have that folded shape, and Cherokee purples, and pink tomatoes from Southwest Arkansas. There's a town down there that's actually got an annual pink tomato festival. And there's white tomatoes and there's brown tomatoes. Time-wise, you never see these in the supermarket, but more and more of them you can see. And more and more of them you will get to see when maybe you grow them at home, or if you come to one of Conway's farmers markets in about a month, you'll see some varieties of tomatoes that you might not suspect existed. And they're there because of thousands of years of artificial selection on wild tomatoes, which produce these little berry-sized fruits. So there. Oh, if you want another example from the supermarket, wild cabbage is this dinky little bad-tasting plant that grows in crappy soils. But at least since the time of the Romans, people have been growing this dinky little thing with just a few leaves that you wouldn't want to eat unless you were starving. And they've carried out artificial selection, and it has produced broccoli, cauliflower, collard greens, head cabbage, and I don't know if you know this one, kohlrabi, which has a big swollen lower stem. There's multiple varieties of vegetables that you might not think were the same species, but in fact they are all descended over the past couple thousand years from this nasty little weed called wild cabbage. They're all Brassica oleracea. Now, Darwin realized that he didn't come up with the idea, he wasn't the first. He actually found the principle of artificial selection laid out in the Chinese had come up with it. There were other scientists that had noticed this. It's kind of hard to miss if you're a farmer, and whether you're going to live or die depends on the quality of the plants that you grow. You tend to figure this out pretty quickly if you're observing the growth of your plants, and your livelihood and your life depends on how good you are at it. I even quote primitive peoples like Mashik Diwias, a woman of a tribe from, I think what's now South Dakota, called the Hidatsa. the Hidatsa lived in the river valleys and they farmed. When you think of Native Americans on the plains, you think of people like the Lakota that lived by hunting bison. But they actually traded with other tribes that lived in the river valleys and farmed. And the Hidatsa did this. And Mashik Diwiats was interviewed in 1912 and gave a very detailed account of how her people used to do farming. They grew corn, beans, squash, and sunflowers. And they were good at it because if they weren't, they'd all die, right? You know, it's not like growing tomatoes where if it's in your garden and if the tomato hornworms get them, well, that just means you're out a little money. They depended on this for survival. And Mashik Diwiats said, in the spring when I came to plant beans, I was very careful to select seed. Seed should be fully ripe, of good color, plump, and of good size. Did I learn from white men thus to select seed? Ha 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 ha, laughing heartily. No, this custom comes down to us from very old times. And it's been figured out basically by every society that ever made the transition to agriculture. Has learned very quickly that you select only the best to produce the next generation. So probably a whole lot of unsung geniuses all around the world have figured that out. Darwin takes it one more step and argues that natural processes do exactly what breeders do. They exert control over which varieties of animal or plant reproduce. In nature, the quote, metaphor, quote, decision as to who reproduces and who doesn't is not made by a breeder. It's not made by a farmer. It's made by the environment as a whole. And it's not a conscious decision. There's nobody really making a decision saying, okay, you go have babies, you die. The environment as a whole is capable of acting as a selector. Given millions of years, if you can go from a tiny berry to a bell pepper, or another tiny berry to a Cherokee purple tomato, or a little silver carp to a fancy goldfish, if you can do that over the course of just a couple thousand years, nature could surely do a lot more if you gave it millions of years to work. And the usual objection is to say, wait a cotton picking minute, selection can generate new breeds, but it can't create anything really new. I get this a lot from people who are, I get this a lot from, people whose brains are scrambled from listening to a little bit too much Barlow Girl, that evolution can't create new kinds of living things. Yeah, you can get new varieties, but not fundamentally new kinds, which immediately raises the question, what exactly is a kind? Well, these are considered two separate species. The rock pigeon, that's the wild one that's been introduced to the Americas. So this is the one you can see flying around here on the left. On the right, actually took that picture some years ago at the aquarium in New Orleans. That is the zoo, not the aquarium. That's the Indonesian pink-necked fruit dove, different genus. You can already see that they're pretty similar to each other. They're about the same size. They've got the same build. They're built like pigeons. They've got very much the same beak shape. There's even some similarities in their coloration, but which are more different from each other? These two, which we put in separate genera, or the yellow runner powder and the Ackerman tumbler, which were produced in maybe a few hundred years by artificial selection. If you were to take those two birds and hand them to a scientist who'd never seen pigeons before, he'd probably classify those as separate species or even separate genera. Or do it again. There's a rock pigeon on the left, the bleeding heart pigeon from the Philippines on the right. And again, similar size, similar build, even similar colors and banding patterns, similar beak. But compare those with the black fantail on the left and the old Dutch capuchin on the right. If you've never seen these birds before and somebody told you those two were wild species, you'd never classify them together. They're different in just about every way. And that's Darwin's point. There's ultimately no real difference between varieties that are produced by artificial selection and species that are found in nature. There's no magical dividing line that the process of selection is forbidden to cross. And as he said, at least a score of pigeons, that's 20 by the way, a score, might be chosen, which if shown to an ornithologist and he were told that they were wild birds, would certainly be ranked by him as well-defined species. Moreover, I do not believe that any ornithologist would place the English carrier, the short-faced tumbler, the runt, the bar, powder, and fantail in the same genus. So there. I'll tell you what, that's actually a pretty good place to pause. It is currently 10:08, so I'll bring the lights up. I'll tell you what, go ahead and take about 12 minutes and we'll reconvene at 10:20. There, go ahead, get up, cut the circulation back, and grab some caffeine if you need. Ow. Everything reasonably clear? Everybody's able to hear me?
Can we go back to the slide,